Stitch spacing, or as it is often referred to, stitch density, is an important factor to consider when creating quality designs. The settings are adjusted in the Object Properties box in the Fills tab. 0.4 mm spacing would be considered by most as a standard setting, but as always, test for fabric, your machine, and personal preference. At least 0.4 mm is a good place to start. Too few stitches will not cover properly, and you may see through the embroidery to the fabric beneath. Too many stitches will give a stiff feel to the design and may cause thread breaks, and of course will take longer to run on the machine. The spacing is measured at the end of each row or between every second line of stitching. The first line being the stitch line and the second a back stitch line. Trapunto. Of course, there is a case for open stitching, as in the sail, where you need to make a light shading. Or, for larger areas, where you want to create a background shape but not waste too many stitches, as in the case of the cloud in this design. The open spacing is referred to as trapunto, and you may need to apply the trapunto settings to hide any travel runs underneath. Look in the Stitch Effects toolbar for this. The trapunto setting will force any travel runs to the edge of the object. Accordion spacing. There is a feature in EmbroideryStudio 4 included with the shading and open fills element called Accordion Spacing, which will change the profile of spacing across the rows of stitching. There are 8 profiles to choose from, and you can set the maximum and minimum spacing values to create the effect you're looking for. Satin columns. When dealing with columns of satin stitch created with column A or column B tool, the standard setting here is also 0.4 mm, with an additional option of auto spacing. A constant spacing will apply the same stitch spacing to the entire length of the column. Auto spacing adjusts the spacing based on the width of the column. Notice the stitch count has changed. Access the settings once the auto spacing button is selected in the table. Where the column width or stitch length is, say, 4 mm wide, make the spacing 0.4 mm. At 8 mm wide, make it 0.34 mm, and at the column width of 0.1 mm, set the spacing at 0.54 mm. In finer columns you need fewer stitches, and wider columns require a higher density. This setting takes care of the calculation for you. See the results here. At the narrow end, the stitches are wider apart, and at the wide end the stitches are closer together. Notice the 90% spacing. This is to say I want to follow the principles of auto spacing but adjust the density to 90% of the spacing value. That is, for example, 90% of 0.4 mm is 0.36 mm. So the lower the percentage, the higher the stitch count, and the higher the percentage, the lower the stitch count. Shortening. Stitches on a curve present another problem. In tight curves, the inside stitches bunch up and look ugly and potentially can cause thread breakage. Shortening is found in the Stitch Effects toolbar or in the Shortening tab in the Object Properties. The standard settings are adequate in most cases, and I think it is enough simply to turn the feature on, but you are able to adjust the settings. If the spacing between stitches is, say, 50% of the standard spacing, based on the auto spacing values, then apply stitch shortening, but do not allow more than 5 consecutive stitches on the same side of the column to shorten. There are further settings available which you can adjust. For example, if the maximum number of consecutive stitches can be shortened is 3, then shorten them to 70%, 90% and 70% of the length of the stitch. This is a very fine adjustment for meticulous digitizers. I would say be aware that they are here, but simply turning the feature on should be enough. Fractional spacing. Curves present another problem. Where do you measure the stitch spacing from? The outside or inside edge? The setting can be found in the Smart Corners properties, and the default is 0.33. In other words, 1/3 of the way in from the outside edge of the column. The further in from the edge, the more widely spaced are the stitches. I would make the same comment as for the spacing setting. In most cases, having the setting turned on at the default value is usually enough. I hope this has helped. Thanks for watching.